The third mistake in moral mathematics is to ignore very small chances when they would either affect very many people or would be taken very many times. The fourth and fifth mistakes are to ignore very small and imperceptible effects on very large numbers of people. These are similar mistakes and can be criticized with the same arguments, but imperceptible effects raise one further question. I need not state both mistakes. The fourth is the same as the fifth, except that very small replaces imperceptible. Many people believe the fifth mistake. If some act has effects on other people that are imperceptible, this act cannot be morally wrong because it has these effects. An act cannot be wrong because of its effects on other people if none of these people could ever notice any difference. Similarly, if some act would have imperceptible effects on other people, these effects cannot make this act what someone ought to do. One kind of imperceptible effect is not controversial. I may cause you serious harm in a way that is imperceptible. The dose of radiation that I give you may be the unknown cause of the cancer that kills you many years later. Though the cause may be unknown, the effect is here perceptible. But in the cases I shall be considering, the effects are imperceptible. Consider first the drops of water. A large number of wounded men lie out in the desert, suffering from intense thirst. We are an equally large number of altruists, each of whom has a pint of water. We could pour these pints into a water cart. This would be driven into the desert, and our water would be shared equally between all these many wounded men. By adding his pint, each of us would enable each wounded man to drink slightly more water, perhaps only an extra drop. Even to a very thirsty man, each of these individual extra drops would be a very small benefit. The effect on each man might even be imperceptible. Assume that the benefit given to each man would be merely the relieving of his intensely painful thirst. There would be no effect on these men's health. Since the benefits would be merely the relief of suffering, these are the kind of benefit of which it can most plausibly be claimed that, to be benefits at all, they must be perceptible. Suppose first that, because the numbers are not very large, the benefit that each of us would give to each man would, though very small, be perceptible. If we make the fourth mistake, we believe that such tiny benefits have no moral significance. We believe that, if some act would give to others such tiny benefits, this cannot make this act what someone ought to do. We are forced to conclude that none of us ought to add his pint. This is clearly the wrong conclusion. Assume next that there are 1,000 wounded men and 1,000 altruists. If we pour our pints into the water cart, each of us will cause each wounded man to drink an extra 1,000th of a pint. These men might notice the difference between drinking no water and 1,000th of a pint. Let us therefore ask, if these men will drink at least 1/10 of a pint, could they notice the effect of drinking any extra 1,000th of a pint? I shall assume that the answer is no. If the answer is yes, we merely need to suppose that there are more altruists and wounded men. There must be some fraction of a pint, whose effect would be too small to be perceptible. Suppose that 100 altruists have already poured their water into the cart. Each of the wounded men will drink at least 1/10 of a pint. We are the other 900 altruists, each of whom could add his pint. Suppose next that we make the fifth mistake. We believe that, if some act would have imperceptible effects on other people, these effects cannot make this act what someone ought to do. If we believe this, we cannot explain why each of us ought to add his pint. It may be said, we can avoid this problem if we redescribe the effect of adding each pint. We need not claim that this gives to each of the men 1/1000th of a pint. We could claim that it gives to one man 1 pint. This claim is false. The water will be shared equally between all these men. When I add my pint, is the effect that an extra man receives a full pint? If I had not added my pint, is there some man who would have received nothing rather than a full pint? Neither of these is true. There is only one correct description of the effect of my act. It gives to each of the 1,000 men an extra 1,000th of a pint. It may be said that we should appeal to the share of the total view. On this view, the share that each contributes is equivalent to the benefit that one man receives from 1 pint. But we cannot appeal to this view, since we saw in section 25 that it can imply absurd conclusions. What we can appeal to is a claim about what we together do. We can claim C10 when 1. The outcome that is best would be the one in which people are benefited most, and 2. Each of the members of some group could act in a certain way, and 3. They would benefit these other people if enough of them acted in this way, and 4. They would benefit these people most if they all acted in this way, and 5. Each of them both knows these facts and believes that enough of them will act in this way. Then 6. Each of them ought to act in this way. Each of us could give to each of the 1,000 wounded men an extra 1,000th of a pint of water. If enough of us act in this way, this will benefit each of these men. And we will benefit these men most if we all act in this way. We know these facts, and we know that enough of us, 100, have already acted in this way. C10 implies correctly that each of us ought to act in this way. Remember now the 5th mistake. On this view, an act cannot be right or wrong because of its effects on other people if these effects are imperceptible. The case just described refutes this view. It is clear that, in this case, each of us should pour his pint into the water cart. Each of us should cause each wounded man to drink an extra 1,000th of a pint. Each of us ought to affect each wounded man in this way, even though these effects are imperceptible. We may believe that, because these effects are imperceptible, each of us is benefiting no one. But even if each benefits no one, we together greatly benefit these wounded men. The effects of all our acts are perceptible. We greatly relieve the intense thirst of these men. Consequentialists may appeal to several principles. They may thus believe that, in some cases, the best outcome is not the one in which people are benefited most. To cover such cases, they can claim C11, when 1. The members of some group would make the outcome better if enough acted in this way, and 2. They would make the outcome best if all of them acted in this way, and 3. Each of them knows both these facts and believes that enough of them will act in this way, then 4. Each of them ought to act in this way. Non-consequentialists believe that, in some cases, we should try to produce the best outcome. In some of these cases, they can appeal to C11. As before, in some cases, C11 does not by itself give the right answer. We would have to add a more complicated claim. I shall ignore these complications. As I showed in section 26, there are 2 kinds of case where we need to appeal to the effects not just of single acts, but of sets of acts. We need to make this appeal when 1. The effects of our acts are overdetermined, or 2. We face coordination problems. We are now considering cases where 3. Each person's act will have imperceptible effects on other people. This may be a third kind of case, in which we need to appeal to the effects of sets of acts. Whether we need to make this appeal depends in part on the answer to another question. Can there be imperceptible harms and benefits? It may be objected, you claim that each of the 1,000 altruists should pour in his pint, since this is how the wounded men would be benefited most. This claim is false. Suppose that one of the altruists does not pour in his pint. Are the wounded men benefited less? They are not. They drink slightly less water, but this effect is imperceptible. Since the effect is imperceptible, the benefit to these men cannot be less. This objection assumes that there cannot be imperceptible benefits. If we make this assumption, we face part of a wider problem, variously called the Sorit's problem, Wong's paradox, or the paradox of the heap. In our case, the benefit is the relieving of intensely painful thirst. If each man receives a pint of water, his thirst will become less painful. His pain will be less bad. Our problem is the following. We assume A. Someone's pain cannot become imperceptibly better or worse. Someone's pain cannot become either less bad or worse if this person could not possibly notice any difference. And it is plausible to assume B. At least as bad as and not worse than are, when applied to pain's transitive relations. Thus, if someone's pain in outcome 2 is at least as bad as it was in outcome 1, and his pain in outcome 3 is at least as bad as it was in outcome 2, his pain in outcome 3 must be at least as bad as it was in outcome 1. 100 altruists have already poured in their pints. Each of the wounded men will drink at least a tenth of a pint. They would not notice the effect of any extra thousandth of a pint. In different possible outcomes, different numbers of altruists will later pour their pints into the cart. Let us refer to these outcomes by citing the number who contribute. Thus, if no one else contributes, this will produce outcome 100. Suppose that one more altruist contributes. Each wounded man will drink more water, but the amount will be so small that he cannot notice this. According to A, each man's thirst cannot become less painful. Each man's pain in outcome 101 must be at least as bad as it would have been in outcome 100. Suppose next that a second altruist adds his pint. As before, none of the men can notice this difference. According to A, each man's thirst cannot become less painful. Each man's pain in outcome 102 must be at least as bad as it would have been in outcome 101. According to B, each man's pain in outcome 102 must be at least as bad as it would have been in outcome 100. The same claims apply if a third altruist contributes. In outcome 103, each man's pain must be at least as bad as it would have been in outcome 100. These claims apply to every further altruist. Suppose that all of us contribute. The result is outcome 1000, in which each man drinks a whole pint. A and B together imply that each man's pain must be at least as bad as it would have been in outcome 100. Drinking a whole pint, rather than only 1/10, cannot do anything to relieve the pain of each man's thirst. Since this inclusion is absurd, we must reject either A or B. Which should go? I reject A. I believe that someone's pain can become less painful or less bad by an amount too small to be noticed. Someone's pain is worse, in the sense that has moral relevance, if this person minds the pain more, or has a stronger desire that the pain cease. I believe that someone can mind his pain slightly less, or have a slightly weaker desire that his pain cease, even though he cannot notice any difference. More generally, there can be imperceptible harms and imperceptible benefits. In many other kinds of case, people have been shown to make very small mistakes when they report the nature of their experiences. Why should we assume that they cannot make such mistakes about the strength of their desire that some pain cease? Suppose that you reject these claims and continue to accept A. You must then reject B. To avoid the absurd conclusion reached above, you must admit that, when applied to pains, at least as bad as, and not worse than, are not transitive relations. And rejecting B has implications like those of rejecting A. You must now admit that your acts may be wrong because of their effects on someone else's pain, even though none of your acts makes this person's pain worse. They may together have this effect. Each act may be wrong, though its effects are imperceptible, because it is one of a set of acts that together make this person's pain very much worse.